Okay, ready, Em?
I was born ready. Okay, ready?
Do it. Yep.
Do it.
This episode is brought to you by adamandeve.com. For 50% off of almost any item, a free gift, and free shipping, use promo code MULTI at checkout.
Wow. That was...
Beautiful.
Whew.
Moving. Stunning.
That was hot stuff.
All right, you ready?
Well, thank you. If you're happy with the same old ways of dating,
If you enjoy sucking at communication,
and you have no desire to improve your romantic life, then our podcast might not be for you.
but if you want some out-of-the-box ideas to deepen your current relationships,
broaden your sexual horizons,
develop a better understanding of yourself,
or learn more about non-monogamy,
Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jase,
I'm Emily.
and I'm Dedeker.
and this is the Multiamory podcast.
Songs I know I did, forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we're talking about sexual incompatibility and infidelity. Opening up about sex is often a challenging and vulnerable part of any relationship, and it can cause relationships to implode or explode. But today, we're going to offer some stits and stats regarding sexual incompatibility, sexual changes over time, and how non-monogamy can help sexual differences. We'll also talk about infidelity and why it can happen even in happy relationships.
But first,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we have two giant big birthday shout-outs.
No tiny birthday shout-outs here.
No.
These are huge, they're meaningful, and one of them comes a little bit late. Sorry about that. But
You
we're
wanna do
doing
it?
it anyways.
Yes, we're doing it anyways. So
All right.
the first shout-out is from our lovely patro, Will,
Uh-huh.
to our other lovely patro, Kenzie. And Will says, "Happy birthday to one of the best people I know. I love you, and I look forward to all of your upcoming adventures. Go kick ass."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So happy birthday. Sorry that that's a little bit late, Kenzie.
I hope she kicks some ass, though.
I hope you kicked ass and are continuing to kick ass now into this
Oh,
new year of your life. And our second one is from Andy to Jen. And this is to wish you a very, very special happy birthday. And that he promised that he would do a dance for you. So be sure you tell him that he needs to do that.
He needs to do that. See, the thing is that Andy just said, "Hey, can you give a shout out for a birthday?" But he didn't give us specifically what to say. So that means we have free license,
Right.
to just cram words right in your mouth.
He's promised a birthday dance.
Okay,
What
birthday
else?
dance,
What else has he
definitely.
promised?
Amazing birthday sex.
Sure. Yeah. Great. Amazing birthday sex. That's kind of a given, I
Yeah,
think.
I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah.
Oh, and he's gonna cook for you, so that's great.
Yeah.
And he's going to do
Enjoy
all
that.
three of those things at the same time.
That's weird. I'm not sure how we
Can
feel
you
about
imagine
that.
how impressive that would be, though?
Dancing, having sex, and cooking dinner.
Yeah. It's like the perfect relationship.
I think it can be done. Challenge accepted.
Okay, anyway,
boy.
well, if any of you would also like to have some kind of shout out on the show, then you can do that by going to patreon.com/multiamory and becoming one of our $15 a month patrons.
So yes, happy birthday to Jen and happy birthday to Kenzie. So moving on to the episode, looking up all of these statistics on sexual incompatibility and articles that were written for married couples specifically, I was really, really amazed at how many of them discussed opening up one's marriage as a way to deal with sexual incompatibility. So
I feel like that's got to be a big change from even 10 years ago, where I feel like a lot of advice articles wouldn't have suggested something like that as a solution to issues with, sexual compatibility in a long-term marriage.
Yeah, I wonder.
yeah, but it definitely, like, a lot of them were saying, oh, don't throw a book in my head or don't freak out at me saying this, but here's something that you can try. And there's a lot of couples out there who do it and a lot of couples who are really pleased about it and all of that stuff. So I found that to be a really interesting idea.
Just as a quick side note, little disclaimer here. These studies primarily deal with heterosexual relationships, cisgender people. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about this kind of sexual incompatibility, infidelity, all these sorts of things for people on the ACE spectrum or for trans people. There is some for same-sex couples, but unfortunately, there's not usually like a one-to-one comparison where they'll do the same study with both same-sex and opposite-sex couples. Anyway, just unfortunately, that is a limitation of the data that we have. But I do feel like a lot of the stuff still applies to any kind of relationship.
I mean, sexual incompatibility happens in so many relationships over time. And unfortunately, it's a leading cause of relationships to end or implode or anything. Yeah.
Right. And I did want to say, too, that also these studies are generally done on monogamous people because that most studies go in assuming that's just what people do.
Right.
But I think that, again, even with that, I think that the findings still can be applied to polyamorous or other types of non-monogamous relationships. I think a lot of the same fundamental pieces are there, especially if people are cohabiting with each other about these types of sexual incompatibility. So with that, who wants to give us some stits and stats?
Well, I'll hop in with this first one that on average, Americans report having sex 85 times a year. And this was according to a survey that was done in 2007. So that may have changed. I mean, I guess it's been 10 years since they did this survey. I feel like I recall from seeing a list of a list of countries that were ranked based on how frequently people living in those countries had sex.
Because they did this study in 26 countries.
Right. That the Greeks have the most sex. They're just going at it all the time. It's something like over 100 times a year.
Okay.
Something ridiculous like that. Maybe not ridiculous, probably great.
It doesn't seem that ridiculous, I guess.
And then at the bottom of the list are the Japanese, where it's something like under 50 times a year, which is still sex once a week, to put it in a little bit of perspective.
Sure.
And then Americans kind of seem to live in the middle ground here with sex around 85 times a year, which is like 1 times per week.
Yeah, 1 point
like
times per week. Yeah.
Yeah, 1.5 times. Like those half times. What do those mean exactly? And what counts as sex
when
versus
only one person
no
got
sex?
off, I guess.
I guess so.
Jeez. Well,
I don't know.
That is true. That is another question of what do you count as sex? And I guess this is people just self-reporting, so it's whatever they would consider sex to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another research survey that surveyed 3,240 men and 3,304 women who were married, living with a partner or in a relationship, and they asked them about their satisfaction with their sex lives. So a majority of men, meaning 54%, and nearly as many women, 42%, said that they were unhappy with the frequency of sex that they had. And this was published, I believe, in the issue of the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy in 2015. So,
yeah. I think it's worth pointing out that this is specifically asking if they're happy with the frequency of sex and not the quality of sex. Just wanted to point that out.
Well, they may have in the study, we just don't have that stat.
Yeah, the only stat we have here is
about the frequency of sex.
About their frequency of sex, yeah.
So speaking of frequency of sex, I mean, I think that we covered that when we were talking about our Science of Happy Relationships episode, where in that one it was they find that about 2 to 3 times a week people are the happiest.
Which puts you well above that average of 85 times a year.
Yeah, quite above the average. That's a lot of sex to have in a year.
But that's how happy you would be the happiest if you were having 2 to 3 times a week.
Again, with the caveat of if you are an allosexual person who gains satisfaction and pleasure out of having sex, if that doesn't apply to you, then of course it's going to be entirely different things.
Yeah.
But I do think that's interesting. But in that study, they didn't really cover whether it's you having sex with multiple people or hookups or sex with the same person. Those were all equally weighted or not?
I'm actually not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure because it was. We'll have to go back and check, but I'm not sure if that one was by the Gottman Institute. And if it was, it makes me think that stat would be specifically about sex for married couples.
Right.
Since that's primarily what they study.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. Well, right. Because it was about just couples because then we talked about the question of, well, how does that then apply to polyamorous relationships? Does that mean that each relationship needs to have sex that many times per week? Because obviously that gets out of hand really fast.
I'm assuming not.
And I don't think so, yeah.
No,
you're having,
just if you
if you
yourself
have 3
are.
partners, then you're having sex 9 times a week.
Right.
And then you're
Wow.
having sex
Though
so many
if you've
times
got
in a year.
if you've got 3 partners and you're having sex with each of them once a week, you're hitting that 3 times a week
That's true.
happiness quotient right there from the study.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's the thing. Okay, so this study published in 2015 from the Social, Psychological, and Personality Science Journal first said that 1 time a week was the only thing that would make you happiest. And if you had more sex than that, it wouldn't make you any less or more happier.
Really?
But then they did a second study group that said and showed that if you were having sex 2 to 3 times a week, then yes, you were happier. So apparently this 2 to 3 times a week number is the one that people are going by now.
Like, that's the magic number.
Apparently, yeah. It
people
used
in
to be just
relationships.
once a week, but
I
people are
see.
wanting more now. People are wanting more.
Well, I feel like all these studies are leaving out this thing that we've talked about in past relationships, but there is this thing known as the Coolidge effect. Have you guys heard of the Coolidge effect?
I have, but
Sure.
can you remind us what it is?
Okay, so it's this really
Like the
silly story
Jennifer Coolidge?
that is the reason why it's called the Coolidge effect. So Calvin Coolidge, who is our president of the United States,
Yep, classic.
he and his wife were touring like a turkey farm or something. And they were touring it separately. Like, he was with all the men and like she was with all the women. And so like the women's group were touring this turkey farm, and their tour guide was explaining that the male turkey will mate with a female turkey like 5 times in a single day.
Okay.
And
Whoa.
Mrs. Coolidge was like, "Can you tell that to my husband?"
Damn.
And then Mr. President Coolidge's group came by, and the tour guide gave them the same fact. And he said, "Oh, is it all with different turkeys?" And the tour guide's like, "Yes." And he said, "Can you tell that to my wife?" I don't know if that story is true or not. It's just kind of anecdotal, and it's almost kind of like the
funny.
setup of a joke, you know?
It does sound like the setup of a joke.
But that's why the name's been given to this thing, the Coolidge effect, which they've found with both humans and also in studies specifically with lab rats, that both male and female lab rats, if you stick, a pair of like a male female lab rat in a cage together, they'll like sex and sex and sex and sex and sex and sex. They'll have sex until they're both exhausted, until they don't want to have sex anymore. However, the instant that you introduce a new rat into the cage, they'll want to have sex with that new rat again. So like
Right.
if you put a new female in the cage, then even though the male is exhausted, then he'll be like, "Oh, okay, no, I can have sex with this rat." And it's the same thing with human beings also, that there is kind of this scientific basis for like variety and newness that does drive our sex drives. And so that's why I think it's interesting that these studies so far have just been studying people who are having sex with the same person over a long period of time, rather than seeing like what are people's sexual satisfaction. Again, like you were saying, like if they're having sex maybe once a week with one partner, but also once a week with another partner,
Right.
would that
How
have
does
the
that
same
compare?
effect? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's continuing to perpetuate this narrative that, like, we are monogamous creatures and need to continue being only with one person, and that when we find the one or the right person, we're only going to ever want to have sex with them.
For sure, yeah.
It's like these studies are setting it up for that to be the case, but then
Well, it's-
also trying to look at sexual satisfaction and other things,
Well,
and
it's
not
something,
really...
yeah, that they talk about like in books like Sex at Dawn, which is that it's
Yeah.
really hard for us to take ourselves out of our cultural context in order to study
Clearly.
these things. It's really hard to separate ourselves from confirmation bias when we're looking at these things. And I mean, that goes both for very pro-monogamy studies and very anti-monogamy studies as well, that,
Right. Or any kind of
it
study.
swings both ways.
Yeah, any kind of study about any part of culture, especially any kind of more like psychological studies, is we do come in with so many assumptions, and many people, scientists included, have a lot of assumptions that we've never even thought were worth questioning. Like we never even thought were questionable.
Right.
Right. And I think that monogamy is a big one for a lot of people. For a lot of scientists studying this stuff might be really fascinated in it, but haven't really considered this. And this is starting to change. We are seeing more studies about non-monogamy. So hopefully this is at least one step toward questioning some of those things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what do we think about what are the reasons driving people being dissatisfied with their sex lives or being dissatisfied with the frequency of sex that they're having? I know that, I mean, I feel like it's a pretty commonly held cultural wisdom that, like, if you're married monogamously for a long time, that you're going to have to try really hard to keep the sex interesting still. There's an entire industry built around trying to reignite the passion. I even hate that phrase because it's used everywhere, reignite that spark, as it were. And I know that people will talk about, like, maybe it varies individually, that some people just naturally have higher sex drives than others. Sometimes it goes through phases. Sometimes people make assumptions along gender lines that, oh yeah, men are horn dogs and women don't want sex. We still have that whole tired out narrative that affects this. But I mean, what do you guys think?
Well, in some of my research that I did today, there were some very religious websites talking about like, it's God's plan if you are having sexual incompatibilities and you just need to work through it. Like, he put this in your way as an obstacle for you to work through and become closer to your husband. And it was very fascinating and made me personally cringe a little bit. Maybe not everyone out there would. But yeah, I found that very interesting. It also said, like, if you have sex before marriage, like, that's a thing that Satan does, so don't do that.
It's a thing that's, I don't know if that's quite wait, hang on, sorry. I think that was lost in translation a little bit. I don't know if sex before marriage is a thing that Satan does. Maybe it's just a thing that he loves.
Well, yeah, it's a thing that, like, people...
That he encourages us to do.
He encourages us to do it.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
That he encourages people to do that, and so definitely don't do that.
Well, there was some religious leader that a couple of years ago, like, put out some article basically saying that if your wife doesn't want to have sex with you, like, just don't look at her face and have sex with her anyway, because, like, it's her duty as your wife to submit to her husband and to give him what he wants. So just, like, don't. It was, like, terrible. And like, all backed by
while I go kill
scripture.
Myself. Oh my god.
Well, more like while I go, like, puke all over myself.
Right.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Jesus.
Anyway, I think we're losing the thread here a little bit.
Sorry.
Okay.
Something
so
that
hormones?
Yes. Something that I wanted to talk about in this was, I think, what Emily was getting to, which was talking about hormone levels and how those will change throughout our life, and that those can also vary from person to person. But I think, generally the one that we go to right away is testosterone.
Right.
But I think something that I wanted to point out, though, is that there's a lot of misconceptions about testosterone. One of those is that testosterone makes you horny and also aggressive, and that it's kind of often associated with sort of negative things, unless you're trying to do, like, bodybuilding, and then I need that for building muscle. But a couple common misconceptions. One is that testosterone is actually a hormone that's very much responsible for lowering your levels of cortisol, for making you less stressed, for also making you more able to focus and to handle your emotions. So it's actually a little bit, with all of the neurotransmitter chemicals like dopamine and serotonin and all of those, there are things where too much of it and too little of it often have very similar symptoms.
Interesting.
That it's more about everything being in balance. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. We're not going to go into brain chemistry in this episode, although that'd be a fun one for the future.
Yeah.
But with testosterone, sort of at different times of day, this might be peaking also throughout your monthly cycle for both men and women.
Yes. For whatever, or however you identify, whatever hormones are in your body.
Right. Yeah. And then also, I guess the other misconception I wanted to address is that, that women, this is not a misconception, that women do have much less testosterone than men, which is one of the excuses people give for, that's why men want sex all the time and women don't. But the fact is that women are much more sensitive to testosterone, so having less of it still has the same effect as it does on a man in terms of things like sex drive and stuff like that.
Interesting.
Because otherwise, if you were looking at that, I mean, women have like a tenth the testosterone of men.
Yeah.
They don't have a tenth the sex drive of men.
Right.
You know,
No.
more and more studies are showing that men and women have basically equal sex drives and basically equal interest in both casual sex and long-term sex and sexual satisfaction and all of that. There's more like cultural factors
Right.
that will make those different for each other. So to go back to the question of how much sex you want to be having, like this study we were talking about earlier that was asking if people are satisfied with the frequency of sex they're having. I think that especially when you look at people as a spectrum and that not everyone's going to be the same, that you might be able to find averages, that I think something important to think about is the question of how much sex do I actually want to be having? Because I do think it would be interesting to do a similar study looking at people who are not in any committed relationships and are just having casual sex, and to ask them, how much sex are you having and are you satisfied with that amount of it? And then to compare it to maybe those same people at another time in their life in a relationship. How much sex are you having? Are you satisfied with it? I think there's a lot to be seen here, because I think that in terms of numbers and amount of time that we're having sex, I think a lot of it can be based on what we think that we should want. Or what we think other people are doing, and that we need to try to match them or be better than them or something.
Yeah, it's challenging how much we place on our partners when we are in a relationship versus maybe when we're single, because potentially when we're single, we're not having sex that often. We may have like a one-night stand or a hookup or something, or like friends with benefits or whatever, and it's not a committed relationship. And we may be having sex frequently less than we would even if we were in some sort of long-standing relationship, but we feel satisfied. And then for whatever reason, when we're in a relationship and we're only having sex once a week and we feel jilted by that, there's something to be said by that. And the question is why? Why do you?
Yeah.
And in reality, it may be more than what you were having before.
That's interesting.
Right. And I think that's absolutely true. I've definitely found that there have been times in my life where maybe I'm having just as much sex as I really want to be having, but I still will feel upset like I'm not having sex enough because it's only once a week, or it's only once every 2 weeks, or, you know, whatever it is at that time in my life, or maybe it's only twice a week. And I'm like, God, that's not enough, because we have this kind of cultural idea, an imagined idea, maybe based on our peers or what kinds of movies or whatever we watch, of like, oh, if I were really in love, or if my life were really exciting, I would be having sex every day. Even if in reality you wouldn't be very happy with that.
Yeah, well, like it's this notion that our partner wanting to have sex with us means that they're interested in us and that we're worthy of their time.
I guess it's true. We do attach so much to it.
Yeah.
I guess it kind of depends on the person and what they've attached to it, I suppose. Because I feel like that question digs into questions of like, what are the expectations for the relationship? Is there a sense of entitlement to sex coming into this that's either conscious or maybe even subconscious? That's interesting.
Also, just the different kind of intentions for having sex. Like, is this sex that we're having in order to get off, or is this sex that we're having in order to connect emotionally with each other? Is this sex that we're having to like have fun and role play with some new thing we've been talking about? Is it sex we're having to try some new physical thing that we've been thinking about doing? That all of those have very different qualities to them. And I think that looking at that in studies would also be interesting to see people's level of satisfaction. And I did want to bring up real quick that we don't have the studies up here right now, but I've definitely read a number of places that have done studies showing that people who are swingers do report higher levels of relationship satisfaction than people who are strictly monogamous. And I do think those studies are interesting to look at. Well, maybe they're having different types of sex, that maybe it's not even so much about the fact that it's with other people, although I think that's definitely a factor with that newness, but they're probably also having different sex. They're having more varied sex and not just kind of the same, let's get off together.
Right. Yeah. So we could talk about this for so many hours,
I know, right?
but I want to bring us back to the more, practical part of this episode, which is if you're finding yourself in a relationship where there is some kind of sexual incompatibility. Or maybe you're just going through a slump, like your partner wants more sex or less sex than you do. What are some things that you can do to actually get your sex life back on track, or back to a place where both of you are feeling happier and more satisfied?
Yeah. Well, I think a good place to start is just to, if you can afford it, to find a therapist to talk to about that, or a counselor, or a life coach or something, who can actually just start having an open dialogue. Because I think a lot of these things can be caused by not having that open dialogue, right? About what kinds of sex you want to be having, or what makes sex even interesting to you in the first place. Is maybe, there might be other things that are missing, and having a third party come in and help you talk about that, or even just with yourself, can be really helpful. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to think about ways that you can generate intimacy and closeness in your relationship outside of sex. It's important to examine, some people have sex in order to feel close, and some people need to feel close first before they want to have sex with somebody. And that can shift and change depending on your life and your context and things like that. But being able to put yourself in that context of like, what are the ways that I can generate closeness that are not about sex, can be ways of actually not only making the intimacy in your relationship better, but maybe making it just a little bit more easy for you, the two of you, to connect sexually as well.
Yeah. And this may not be spontaneous or feel like something you really want to do, but schedule it. Like, maybe there's only a couple times a week in which you're not coming home super late from work and you don't feel super tired, or you have like a morning together or a day together or something. Just schedule sex for those times, and it can become something that you look forward to and that you're excited about, and then it can just become and work into your daily routine each week.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces to this, because the complaint people will give is, oh, well, that kind of takes the like romancing and flirting out of it. And I would say, on the contrary, if it's something that you have a plan to do this evening, say, while you're at work, you could be sending each other flirty text messages about it.
Like, ahead of time.
Right. You know that this is going to be received because we have a plan to do this together. I've also found that for Dedeker and myself, if we'll schedule like date nights that don't even have to be specifically we're going to have sex, it's just we're going to spend time together, we're not going to work, we're going to have our projects done, we're going to pretty up, we're going to take a shower, right? We work from home, so sometimes we can let that slide a bit.
Sometimes you get kind of barbaric.
Right? But just kind of knowing that we're going to be spending quality time together, whether it's about sex or not, is incredibly important, and I think will also lead to having more sex and at least having those opportunities for intimacy, like you were saying, not just sex, but other types of intimacy by doing other things to show that you prioritize each other and that you value your time with each other. I'd say the next one would be to tap into your fantasies. Like we were just talking about, sexual satisfaction doesn't have to just be a numbers game. It could be what kind of sex you're having.
I think this note is actually a good one where a therapist comes in really handy.
For sure, helping you uncover that.
To help you uncover that, to help you be able to have those vulnerable talks, because especially if you have some kind of sexual fantasy that you don't think is going to be received well, or maybe that's even been rejected in the past by your partner or by other partners or by ex-partners or whatever, there can definitely be a lot of baggage surrounding that, and getting help for that process to open up and talk about these things. And a therapist can even help you find like a compromise. If you have a fantasy that your partner's not so into, having a third party there can really help you to kind of find a safe middle ground that both of you can play in.
Yeah, I think also with fantasies, if they have been rejected before, sometimes that can be because of a lack of understanding of what's behind the fantasy. Like, what is it about it that makes it exciting? I think that can be really important, that a therapist can help you find. Because I know that, for example, for me, there are, fantasies or role plays or things that I've done with partners and had a really fun time doing it, that if you'd said to me, like, oh, this type of, like, what about this kind of sex, 4 years ago, I might have said, oh, no way, like, that seems really weird to me. I don't get it. Like, why would anyone want to do that? It's because I didn't understand, because I'd never really had is it something I hadn't thought of before? So it's not something I'd really looked at, like, what are the pieces of this that would make it fun? And I think that's the type of thing that specifically a sex therapist, especially if they're a kink-aware professional, that they'll be able to help you understand those things and help you communicate better with each other about, here, this is what's actually exciting to me about this. What if we modified it this way so there's still that excitement in it, and now you understand it?
Right.
I think also reading erotica can help with that too.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
'Cause it gets
Love
you
that.
in the heads of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And bouncing off of that, communication, as we always say on this. But yeah, and I mean, therapy can help with that for sure, but just opening up and choosing to be vulnerable with your partner. Sex is a very challenging thing to talk about, and it can bring up a lot of scary emotions. It can bring up past traumas, past anything that occurred to you in a sexual situation. I know for me, sex has been challenging because of those things. And yet, when you're able to be vulnerable with your partner, it really is lovely to open yourself up to them and to allow new and beautiful things to come out of that. So a sex therapist can also help with this kind of thing, with learning communicative strategies for sex and talking about it with your partner.
And then another thing to consider, if you're finding that, the sex life in your relationship has become not so great, this is kind of a challenging question. But I think it's worth considering, and that's to ask yourself, was the sex even good in the first place? And that sounds like a very confronting question, but there's this really interesting article that I read on The Telegraph, and making the argument that, so first of all, if we look at statistics and we see that women in casual hookups, casual sex, are much less likely to be satisfied than men are. Like, they're much less likely to have an orgasm or to have the sex that they want to have. However, women still do seek out casual hookups because sleeping with new people is exciting. Sleeping with new people that you're attracted to is exciting, and that newness can be something that can make the sex interesting and exciting even if you don't have an orgasm. However, if you start to develop a relationship with someone, an ongoing relationship or an ongoing sexual relationship, when that newness starts to wear off, then you're just left with maybe sex that was mediocre to begin with, honestly. and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But just checking in and thinking back, like, even when I had sex with this person for the first time, like, was the sex that good? Like, outside of me being really interested in them as a person, like, were they receptive to my communication? Did I try to communicate what I needed? Because if you didn't set a foundation of actually communicating what kind of sex you like, or what does get you off, or what does feel good, that can carry over as you develop a relationship. So again, if you think back and realize, like, oh, actually the sex has never really been that good, doesn't mean that you're doomed, but it just means it's something to think about and something to be aware of moving forward. That, like, okay, that means that maybe we just need kind of a little bit more of a paradigm shift, and we need to change the way that things, the way that we're communicating about sex.
I would add to that too, that even if your sex was really good at the beginning, that I think often we get caught up in this idea of, I want to get back to the kind of sex that we used to have. And I think that kind of thinking, or even, in anything, trying to get back to the kind of romance and excitement that we had at the beginning, that will usually lead you to be disappointed, partly because going backwards is a difficult thing to do, but secondly,
the world only spins forward.
Right, because also your memories of what that was aren't necessarily the reality of it.
Right.
So if you're able to change your focus in terms of sex to finding new things, finding new ways to connect, finding new things that you want to try, which does involve a lot of communication, that will be more likely to lead you to having fulfilling, enjoyable sex than trying to just get back to what you think you remember sex was like when you first started dating.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the last one here, kind of another somewhat challenging question, is to ask yourself, is this even about sex at all? Maybe you do still feel very attracted to your partner. When you do have sex, it is still very passionate and exciting and connected and satisfying. It could be about something else entirely. One or both of you could just be very stressed or very distracted, both in good or bad ways. And I know that, some people seek out sex as a way to relax, and some people seek out sex only after they're relaxed. Like they can't have sex until they're relaxed. So it's very important to check in and be like, which one am I? Is my partner in a different modality? How can we understand that about each other and kind of tailor our sex lives and how we approach each other appropriately based on that information?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And
I
to
think
understanding.
You just said we said the same words. No, but I mean, understanding is a huge thing. I think so much blame gets tossed around in sex, and like, well, you don't want this. You always say no to me. Blah blah blah. But having understanding and compassion for your partner in any area, that maybe they see sex as a way that one is giving love, and that if you're not having it with them, then maybe they feel left out or like they're not being loved in the way that they want. And compassion on the other side, like maybe someone just wants to emotionally connect, and that sex they see as just something physical and it's not giving them what they want. I think having compassion for both sides is incredibly important here.
Yeah, definitely. Learning to speak each other's languages. We've talked about it with love languages and apology languages. We should make our own guide to the 5 sex languages.
I don't know if Dr. Gary Chapman would get on that one, but
That'll be our own thing.
Yay!
We've also had a lot of really great conversations about this in our patron-only Facebook group.
yeah, definitely.
Our patron community is amazing. It's full of great people who listen to this show, who find these things valuable, and who, I think more importantly, are interested in bettering themselves and interested in understanding the best ways to have relationships, whatever those are, whether they're the monogamous person in a mono-poly relationship, or whether they're polyamorous and have been doing it forever, or they're new to it. And we have this very active Facebook group that's secret, so no one can see it unless they're a patron. And you can join that by going to patreon.com/multiamory and contributing to our show at the $5 a month level or higher. We also have a monthly video discussion group, which is a really great place and often goes from fun and silliness to real serious, heavy topics and some tears. The whole range of that in this really great supportive online video discussion every month at the $9 and up level. Or if you want to get a shout out on the show, like at the beginning of this episode, then you can do that at the $15 a month and up level, and it will help us to keep doing this. We've got live events that we want to start doing, and we're hoping to get those going once we hit our next Patreon goal. So if you haven't already done it, please consider joining at our Patreon at patreon.com/multiamory.
The other thing that you can do is you can go to iTunes or Stitcher and you can leave us a review. Anytime we get to leave your reviews, we just feel honestly so warm and fuzzy, and often there's tears shed. So the encouraging words really do help us to have the motivation to keep going. But most importantly, it helps our shows show up higher in search results. It helps us to expand our audience. It's a very easy, cheap thing that you can do that won't take a lot of time to help support our show. So again, just go to iTunes or Stitcher and leave us a review.
And finally, adamandeve.com, our oldest and most beloved, well, all of them. We love all of you, our little sponsors, but Adam and Eve for sure, we very much love. And you get an amazing thing for using our promo code, 50% off of almost any item, a free sex swing, wow, and free shipping by using promo code MULTI at checkout. And then that code is reusable for subsequent purchases, so be sure to use it again and again to help us out. So MULTI, M-U-L-T-I at checkout for 50% off of one item, a sex swing, and free shipping.
Woo.
And with that, back to the show.
Now let's talk about cheating and adultery.
Yay!
Oh God, yeah. See, and this one is important because I think there's a lot of people out there for whom this has been a thing in their lives, or they come from families that have had this in there. I personally was born out of a literal affair, so it's a very prevalent thing in my life.
Not a figurative affair?
Not a figurative one, no. My father was married and my mother had an affair with him. So, and then I was their love baby. So it definitely, well, truly, it definitely has changed my life. And I think it can change a lot of people's lives. And it's caused me to look at the reasons behind why this happens in relationships. So,
yeah,
let's go from there.
So according to divorcestatistics.info, in the United States, 17% of all divorces that occur are due to adultery from one or the other partner. Mm-hmm. And I did want to point out, this is interesting, that it's definitely not the leading cause of divorce, which I believe is money.
Money, yeah, I think it's money.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it is still 17% is fairly significant. And that's also considering that of these 17% of divorces, what about all of the ones that have had affairs or infidelity that didn't get divorced?
Right.
Totally.
Yeah, exactly. Like and because the rate of that, it's like, it's like what? It's like 50% of affairs are never found out, right?
Well, this is the tricky thing.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
So we have one study here that shows that 22% of married men have committed an adulterous act at least once in their life, and 14% of married women have had affairs at least once during their married lives. I've seen other studies that have put these numbers as high as 50% for both sides, putting the numbers much closer. I've also heard another statistic that 80% of marriages have had some kind of infidelity from one partner or the other in them, right? It's a difficult thing because it relies on people self-reporting,
right,
for one.
It relies on different definitions of infidelity,
Exactly. Which is something we talked about in our conscious monogamy episode of what does count as infidelity for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So these studies can really vary. But basically the takeaway here is that it happens. This is a very real thing. It's not something we can just ignore or say, oh, if people just tried harder or loved harder, then this isn't going to happen, that we can just fix this. But that's not, it's not that simple.
Yeah, well, and the thing is that infidelity happens also in relationships that are happy and functioning and not falling apart. And Esther Perel, who's a therapist and social researcher, she's written and spoken a lot about this particular subject. Her amazing book, Mating in Captivity. And
she's got some good TED Talks as well.
She's got some great TED Talks. Yeah, exactly. That she covers this subject a lot of like this paradox of being in monogamous long-term relationships and trying to make the sex better, even though the rest of the relationship is fine. I don't know, I think it's, the same topics that a lot of the polyamorous community has been talking about for years. It's just that, she presents it in this very, I think easy to swallow, scientifically backed kind of way. And so she wrote this Atlantic article called Why Happy People Cheat.
It was a great article.
Yeah, it's a fantastic article. And I think what really struck me about it is that she mentions the fact that years and years and years ago, we knew that marriage wasn't going to fulfill us in every single front. Especially when marriages were arranged or when they were political or when it was some kind of financial transaction, when it really was just the business contract. Like, we knew that this person wasn't supposed to be our lover, our best friend, our parent, our caretaker, our absolute everything. And so sleeping with somebody else was just kind of like a reaction to that. It's like, well, I know very pragmatically my wife or my husband isn't supposed to be my lover, basically. There's so many stories of like the French royal court for hundreds and hundreds of years. That was just like so common that it's like, we're practically quite open about it, that you have your spouse and that you have your lover or multiple lovers. And what's changed now is that now that marriage is no longer seen as this business contract, now it is this super romantic thing. Now we are supposed to be fulfilled by absolutely everything by our partner. Now we stray and now we cheat because our relationships and our marriages failed to deliver what we thought that they were going to deliver, which was like
everything.
Endless satisfaction and everything.
Yeah. Well, in addition, people live so much longer now than they ever have before, which is going to cause, you change so much over the course of your life, and the person that you were when you married, Ted, may be different than you were, good old Ted when you were 25, maybe very different than when you're 65 or 45 or whatever. And it just may cause different things to occur within you. And you may want something different than just good old Ted at 25.
It reminds me, I forget who it was, but I was watching some stand-up comedian who did make this joke that like the people who invented marriage invented it at a time when everyone lived till they were like 40. Like if the people who invented marriage saw what marriage was today, they'd be like, no, this is not what we intended at all. Like, no, we didn't want you to be with the same person for 60 years. That's ridiculous.
Right. So the important takeaway too from this is just to go back to that idea that people will have affairs even if they're very satisfied in their relationship, even if they're having good sex in their relationship, that people will sometimes still seek out affairs or have affairs, and that draw toward newness, toward novelty, toward exploring other sides of ourselves as well as connecting with other people, that is just a part of our makeup as these social primates that we are. And that regardless of what you choose to do about that, whether it's choosing to be polyamorous or be, swingers or some other kind of non-monogamy, or if you choose to be monogamous, no matter what, I think the big thing that I would love everyone to just be imbued with this knowledge is that nothing about you or your relationship is broken if you want to have sex with other people. Regardless of what you decide to do with that information is fine. And I think that a lot of people might actually be less likely to make irresponsible choices that might hurt their current relationships if they accepted that. If they understood, okay, nothing's broken about me and nothing's wrong with my relationship, the fact that I want to have sex with this other person, so knowing that I can make the choice to not do that if that's going to hurt my relationship, right? Or I can communicate about it, either one. But instead we get caught up in this kind of romanticization of what a marriage is and what a relationship is, that it's going to satisfy everything and we'll never have eyes for anyone else, as the line goes.
For the next 60 years.
Yeah.
Right. And then if we do, we feel like we're broken, or we feel like this relationship must not quite be the right one, or, just all these awful things that we beat ourselves up about and that we don't communicate about because of that.
It's part of the reason why I was so freaking bored when I finally watched Eyes Wide Shut for the first time, which was only like,
oh, Stanley,
maybe 2 years ago. I didn't see it when it first came out, and so I'd only watched it really like after I'd kind of had my own sexual awakening and after I'd already been non-monogamous for so many years that I was like, okay, first of all, never been to a sex party that actually looks like that. That's not what they actually look like. Second of all, I'm just like, just talk to her. Like, your wife's hot and like you seem to have good communication and like you guys have hot sex. It's like, just freaking talk to her. Like I was just like so bored this entire movie, him just being and I'm just like, dude. Anyway, I guess
Jase and I watched that movie together.
We did, yeah. I guess in the
90s,
neither had I.
More
well,
scandalous.
I think for most people still today, that whole
I get
concept
it. I get it it's challenging, and it's like, I don't know, Kubrick is Kubrick. We can appreciate it for that.
We'll save that for our multi-filmery podcast, where I can rant about my thoughts about Kubrick as a director.
At least he's not as bad as Terrence Malick.
Hey,
okay,
The New World is one of my favorite movies. Tree of Life was terrible, but The New World was one of my favorites. Okay. And we are really not supposed to be talking about this on this podcast.
Let's save this for our film review podcast that will be made someday. Who knows?
Okay, I'm going to get us back on track.
Get us back on track, please.
Okay, to get us back on track. So the question that often gets posed to me, specifically as a coach, is, can an open marriage or non-monogamy or polyamory either prevent the potential fallout of infidelity, or can it be a solution to recover from infidelity?
Well, can it?
Well, the thing is, I mean, there isn't any statistics on this yet. They haven't yet studied couples who have a history of infidelity and then opened their marriage and then tried to track how satisfied they were or how happy they were after that. Like, we don't have the studies on that yet, unfortunately. Anecdotally, from working with my clients, I feel like I see basically like a 50-50 success rate. That sometimes infidelity happens in a monogamous marriage, and that is the thing that finally forces the conversation to happen between two people about expectations, about what they actually feel about each other, about what they need, either sexually or emotionally. And they're either able to be like, okay, we can kind of reconnect again monogamously now that we know more about what each other needs, or they can decide, okay, well, let's try this new paradigm. Let's try opening up. now that we know what each other need, and then they move forward, and then the infidelity is an unfortunate inciting incident, but it gets them on this track towards maybe a relationship that's going to ultimately make both parties happier. However, I feel like with just as much frequency, infidelity happens. Maybe a couple tries to kind of reactively be like, well, maybe if we have an open marriage, we can still stay together, but then somebody, one or both of us can get these other needs met. But there's still been this betrayal of trust. It still probably happened in a context of not being able to communicate. So those bad communication habits or totally absent communication habits may still be affecting them. And it can also still cause some resentment that can on the flip side make it twice as hard to open up after that. So it's a hard question. Like for some people, yes, I would say it would be a great solution. For other people, I would say no. Definitely not. It's not, but I don't think that, just going to an open marriage or polyamory, anything like that is going to be the number one go-to solution after infidelity. But
well, I think something else that we've talked about before on this show is, when people will ask, oh, well, does being in open relationships, make them better? Like, does it solve these problems? And, in this case, it could be this infidelity, or does it solve whatever other problems about the passion in your relationships or about becoming codependent with people, whatever it is. And my answer, at least to that, is pretty much always that the skills and the traits, like you were just talking about, having honest communication about what it is you want and finding solutions to it, things like that those skills, amongst others, are important for any kind of relationship, whether it's non-monogamous or monogamous. It's just that in monogamous relationships, so often we don't think we need to do any work because we're sold this myth that if we find the right person, all our problems are solved for us. That at least in non-monogamy, we know we're going off that script. So people, I think, are a little bit more likely to have more serious conversations and do more introspection about it. But that said, I do think people still get into polyamory or non-monogamy also hoping it will be this same magic bullet that they thought finding the one would be. Right. That it's like, oh, well, if I just do this, that's going to solve all of my problems. And then when it doesn't, they get disillusioned with it, or they are less honest than they need to be to make it actually work. And so then, it all ends up falling apart. But just this idea that neither one is this magical solution. Kind of like we were talking about with love is not enough. Right. Also, polyamory is not enough. Yeah. You can't just be poly and now you're great at relationships.
Just nothing's enough.
No, you have to work at it. Life is work.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's okay.
Working at improving yourself and getting better and better in your relationships. And I know that sounds like a lot of work, and sometimes it will be. But I think that overall, the rewards from that and the fun that you can have doing that once you start getting used to doing those sorts of things and asking those kinds of questions of yourself will actually be much more enjoyable in the long run.
Well, let's get to work on this multi-film review podcast.
I know, right? Who would tune into that? Please let us know. You can tweet at us at Multiamory and let us know if you want to see our multi-filmery podcast. With that, thank you all so much. If you would like to have a question or comment played on our show, you can call us at 678-MULTI-05, and that 678 is the area code, just so you know. Also, you can email us at info@multiamory.com, or you can send us a message on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. You can also leave us a voice message through Facebook if you'd like to have your question played on the show. To support our show, to join our private Facebook community, you can go to patreon.com/multiamory. You can also get a shout out on the show at the $15 and up level. Multiamory is created and produced by Dedeker, Winston, Emily Matlack, and me, Jase Lindgren. Our episodes are edited by Mauricio. Our social media wizard is Will McMillan, and our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP.
Hey, this is Andrew Gurza, disability awareness consultant, crippled content creator, and host of Disability After Dark, the podcast to shine a bright light on sex and disability. And you're listening to a Swing Set podcast at swingset.fm.